Here in America, work is in trouble. We've offshored our manufacturing, sent away good jobs, and lost so much ability to make things. American Giant is a company that's pushing back against this tide. They make high-quality clothing, sweatshirts, jeans, dresses, jackets, and so much more, right here in the USA. Visit American-Giant.com and get 20% off your first order when you use code STAPLE20 at checkout. That's 20% off your first order at American-Giant.com, promo code STAPLE20.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Season 3 of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control, and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions, and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy, like a trip to the cinema, or exercise, or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions, and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your tickets. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your speaker, Kacey, and today I'm joined by a guest that I have had the chance to speak with previously when we did our monthly book club. Hello and welcome, Cait West.
Hello, Kacey. So good to talk to you.
We are going to be discussing your experiences and your recent memoir, Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. There's a few memoirs floating around at the moment that are tackling this same subject. Has that interfered with your experience, do you think, of releasing such a niche memoir?
I think it's a good thing. I think the more stories we have around this topic, the better, because no one experience is going to represent everyone. And I think we can help each other. And I think it gives more context to people's understanding. For instance, like when Shiny Happy People, that documentary came out last year, that has given a lot of people context for what I'm talking about in the book. So I think the more the better.
And in terms of feedback from the memoir itself, have you received a lot of reviews or emails from people expressing how familiar or validating they found your writing?
Yes, definitely. I think, I've always gotten messages since I started talking publicly about my story. It definitely has increased since my book has been out, and getting a lot of, emails and private messages from people who have been in such similar situations or who are still in them. It's validating and also heartbreaking to know how many people can relate and how much pain there is around this kind of topic. But also, like, I'm really hoping, and I've seen so far, like, the ability to open up this conversation, just because the more of us who speak up, the more people feel safe to do that. So that's what I'm hopeful about.
This book, as I talked about, I have had the chance to finish the book. I hadn't when we met for book club, but since then I finished my course and had a chance to sit down and read. But even in reading the earlier chapters, I spoke to you about how much I really enjoyed your sort of playing with words that describe geography and landmarks, and the way that you were able to describe the land was really, really beautiful. And we talked a little bit about why the book is called Rift. And so I wondered if you could just talk the listeners through your decision in naming the book Rift.
Sure. I started writing this in college. I was studying creative writing, and this began as my thesis project, and it's always been called Rift, which is interesting that the publisher agreed and we could stick with that name. I mean, it's a word for me that can mean so many different things. Like, there's the personal rift in my family of when I left and how it felt like a ripping away of my past. And then also this journey of feeling like there's a rift inside of myself, like in my sense of identity. And finding a metaphor for that is difficult because, you know, it's hard to put into language what that feels like when your family, your sense of self is falling apart and you don't know how to rebuild. Looking to the places I've lived in the land, that's always been a big part of how I feel grounded in the world. And so I wanted to write about the places I've lived, and then discovering about how geology has changed over long periods of time gave me that sense of what it feels like to at once feels like it's destruction, but also creation. So like in a rift in geology, it's when two parts of the earth pull apart, right? And the metaphor for me is meaningful because there's two sides, but then if you dig down deep enough, they're still connected at some place, or they still are made of the same kinds of materials. And so that's what it felt like to me. It's not quite the binary that we sometimes want it to have. We want to have a before and an after. And that's not really how life works in my experience. And so it gave me room to explore that and also just write about the places I've lived, which have been really meaningful to me and figuring out who I am in the world.
So beautifully written. And I loved the way that you talk about not really being able to have a clean break. You can't just decide to walk away from something and then it's done with and it's out of your life. Psychologically and physically, there's always going to be things that will connect you somehow to those experiences that you had. And it's like you say, you know, like roots in the earth or the connecting of the plates under the earth. They're still going to be attached in some places. And I think that's a really cool and unique way of describing it that I'd not come across before. But for people that are listening who perhaps haven't picked up the book or don't know too much about Christian patriarchy, could you describe what it was like for you yourself growing up in Christian patriarchy in your earlier years?
Sure. So the book covers me from, I was born in the late 80s until, you know, I left in 2013. And so in the 90s, early 2000s, there was this thing called the Christian patriarchy movement. And that word, biblical patriarchy, Christian patriarchy, was something that my family used, that other people in this movement used. It wasn't your typical cult where it's like a top-down hierarchy. It was very grassroots based. It spread across different kinds of churches, different denominations, and the father of each home was like the patriarch. So it's kind of like a mini cult leader for each family, tied together by this ideology that God created the world to be a patriarchy. And men are in charge, women follow, and children are raised to fit into those gender roles. And This was spread through things like Patriarch magazine in the US and organizations like Vision Forum. I considered the IBLP part of this a little bit earlier in time than Vision Forum. And a lot of it spread through the homeschooling community because, homeschooling conventions, these ideas kind of took root through that. And that's how I was raised. I was raised homeschooled, very sheltered. My dad got deeper and deeper into this ideology and more controlling. And I think reference points people usually recognize, like the Duggar family. That's an example of very public family in this movement. The quiverful ideology of have as many children as possible. That's part of this whole movement. It's tricky because a lot of people use different terminology and it's not like this structured organization, but it still exists. I think we see a lot of the shift going from the term Christian patriarchy and it's blending into the Christian nationalist movement in the US. And so that has been interesting to watch. But for me, early childhood, I was told you're going to be a wife and a mother someday. That's your goal. There's no plan of other kinds of education or other kinds of dreams. Everything was shaped around my identity as a girl in this movement, and my role was to serve men.
And when you're a child and you're growing up and you're being taught those messages, does it become sort of like a goal that you want to achieve because you're being told that would be the best thing that you could be, and that would be serving God and your father in the best way possible? Or is it something you recognized at an early age was maybe not something you wanted to do?
I think I was very confused because I wanted to make God happy, because in my family, making my dad happy was making God happy. And so very dysfunctional family. And I was terrified of hell, taught that we're sinners and we deserve hell. And so a lot of my childhood was based around fear, and there was never another option presented to me. So I didn't have a lot of room to think outside of that box. At the same time, I didn't really think about being a mother or a stay-at-home wife. It just didn't really seem that appealing to me. So I had a lot of secret dreams of wanting to become a professional musician or a writer. And I just didn't talk about those things because they weren't acceptable. And I had to figure out a way to put my interests inside of this world. So I could play piano, but I had to play for church, for instance, or I had to play for family worship. And that's where my gifts would be accepted, not as a career or something that I wanted to do full time. So yeah, it was very confusing because I believed I was broken, right? I believed I was a sinner. So any of those dreams that didn't fit into the rules, I felt some shame about. And yeah, it was just very confusing to know what was right and wrong for me.
You have siblings, but you were the only or the first one to be homeschooled. What was the decision around the decision-making process around you being homeschooled? And do you think that impacted your experiences of Christian patriarchy differently than the way your siblings experienced it when they were attending public school?
Yes. So I have two older siblings and one younger sibling. My two older siblings, there's a 6-year gap between us. So they're a bit older than me. They started in public school, then they shifted to private Christian school. And I did go to that school for a few months in kindergarten before my dad changed his mind. And I think he was listening to a lot of, I don't know how to call it now, ultra conservative radio talk shows like Rush Limbaugh, and I'm sure Focus on the Family and James Dobson was in there somewhere. And this idea of homeschooling as the truly godly way to raise your kids and to keep them safe from the evils of the world became this glorified idea of education. And so I think for my parents, because I was so young, they're like, let's start her now because she won't have to transition like my older siblings had all these experiences with having classmates and friends. And so it was easier for them to pull me into homeschooling. At the same time, our church started a classical Christian school, which is also connected to the Christian patriarchy movement. So this school was run by our church, and my parents transitioned the older two kids to that school, which I think was easier for them since they were used to having classmates. But I was the one that they started to homeschool. So it's an interesting choice that they made, but it kind of shows like the escalation in the ideology as you go down the roads of children.
The curriculum that was used for you in your homeschooling environment, I mean, I use the word curriculum loosely because it's very different to what I experienced in my journey through public school. Could you describe for us what your curriculum looked like, and if that was kind of in keeping or different to the homeschooling movement that we're seeing become more and more popular throughout America today?
Yeah, so, homeschooling used to be illegal in the US. And then the rules started to change in the 80s, I believe. And so I was being homeschooled during the time when it was becoming more and more safe to homeschool, more allowed in different states in the US. And the curriculum was almost all religious based and very fundamentalist religious. So we had Becca, Bob Jones University, these kinds of, very Bible-based types of subjects. So everything was based in the Bible, like science and reading and things like that. And you could pick and choose from these different companies to create whatever curriculum you wanted. And every state had different, rules about this. A lot of them, or most of them, had almost no rules about this. And that continues today. That's one of the lingering problems with homeschooling now, is there are almost no regulations on whether kids get a decent education. So for instance, if you're a girl and your parents don't want to teach you science, a lot of states aren't going to check on that. And now we're seeing, like, after the pandemic, a lot of people are starting to homeschool more and more in the US. I'm not sure what it's like in the UK, if that's even a thing. But for the US, homeschooling has just exponentially grown. And the problem is the curriculums have not matched that. So a lot of people, their choices in the homeschooling conventions, the homeschooling catalogs, it's all still religious based. There are more options, but that legacy of the early fundamentalist curriculum is still there. And so it's a problem when people don't recognize the roots of homeschooling here, and they're getting into it for other reasons, non-religious reasons, which could be very valid, but their choices in how to educate their kids are very limited. So it's an interesting, in-process situation to see what happens there. I personally, I don't really care what kind of education people choose for their kids. I think that there needs to be safe regulations to make sure the kids are safe no matter where they are. Yeah, so I think it's an ongoing situation, and there's an organization here called the Coalition for Responsible Home Education that's trying to push for better legislation so that kids who are homeschooled are protected from abuse and neglect. And that's an organization run by homeschool alumni, right? So it's taken us to grow up to really say, you need to have better standards for your kids.
Especially when I imagine in a lot of Christian patriarchal circles, and probably other major religious spaces as well, there are mothers that are going through the homeschooling curriculum with their children. And if it's a generational familial setting of, mums before those mums have all done the child rearing, then there's a chance that kind of more secular, worldly ideas are not even within the curriculum or within the conversations that the mums are having with the children in the homes, because they were never taught those things and they had never experienced those things either. And when you, because you had a room in your home where you were homeschooled, it was turned into like a mini classroom. Do you recall what your day-to-day would look like when you were doing your schooling at home?
Yeah, so I started homeschooling in Pennsylvania, and the regulations there were a little bit better than they were in Colorado, where we moved later. My mother is very organized. She didn't have a college degree, but she was very invested in us kids having an education. And she would create lesson plans. Like, she would have this little notebook, and every day would be a list of tasks to do. And she got us involved in other co-ops so that we could interact with other homeschooled kids. So my early days of homeschooling were the best days, and she had to meet with like a school representative and like prove the things that we were taught. And this is when I was like 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And so that was the best times. And then when we moved to Colorado, those regulations weren't in place, and I started to get into the higher grades that my mother didn't feel quite as qualified to teach. And so it became more and more of, here are your subjects, here's your textbooks, read these for yourself, take this test. And then sometimes I would be given the test answer key and grade my own tests. And so a lot of it was just like self-education throughout high school. And that was I think I'm kind of I was a quiet kid and very studious. And so I did okay with that, but also was very lonely. And I don't think that would have worked for every kind of kid's personality. So it was just an interesting experience. But again, from early childhood to high school, everything was very much had to be taught in a so-called biblical worldview, or it wasn't valid education.
You mentioned earlier on about the role that you were told you had in your family from a young age in terms of growing up and marrying and having children of your own. What role did purity culture have on you as a child, and when did you start to become aware of this thing that surrounds women and girls that's never really explicitly spoken about but is very much in existence?
Yeah, from almost since I can remember, I was taught about being modest. And early in the book, I have this scene, one of my earliest memories, a scene of one of my earliest memories where I'm being scolded for wearing a 2-piece bathing suit that I had been given, like as a hand-me-down. And I was only 5, and my dad made me change into a different bathing suit. And it was very confusing because I didn't understand the difference, except that I just felt all this shame about me and my body, as a little girl. And so that was early on the messages I was getting of shame about my body. I have to cover it up, especially being a girl. I didn't want to tempt men. And so, looking back now, it's such a messed up thing to put on a little girl, is to protect her. You should be protecting her from men, not trying to tell her that she's the temptation for men. And so that was early on. In my family, it was very explicit purity culture, to the point that, you don't go on dates, you do courtship, you don't kiss until you're getting married, you don't hold hands until you're betrothed, you don't have any kind of physical contact, right, until you're married in that way. And then on top of that was this emotional purity, this teaching that our emotions should be saved for your spouse. And so you could go through a whole courtship and you wouldn't be allowed to have feelings for the other person because you weren't committed to marrying them. And so that would have been considered cheating, to have feelings outside of the boundaries. And so you have got the sexual purity, and you've got the emotional purity on top of that. And it makes you kind of disconnect and dissociate from your body. in a way that you can't really relate to other people because it doesn't feel safe to do that.
Are you, when you're told that as a girl or a woman, you shouldn't tempt men with the way that you dress or the way that you behave, is it explained to you what temptation means? Or is it just a word that's thrown around and you're just like, I better not tempt people? And you're just kind of left with answering what that means for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the idea was I always understood no sex before marriage, right? And you don't want to tempt men to want that or to think about that before marriage. At the same time, I wasn't taught what sex was. So I had zero sex education. So yeah, it was like this fuzzy idea in my head of don't tempt people, but I'm not really sure what I'm stopping them from doing. And there was no differentiation between consensual sex and non-consensual, sexual assault. And so it was all just temptation and keeping men from temptation. And so that was very confusing after I left, figuring out, there's this idea of consent and you should have a say over what happens to your body, because that did not exist in this world.
And you should feel good when you're with a sexual partner and it's consensual. It should feel good for both people. And this idea that women and men are married to one another without having any kind of even knowing if you're compatible with the way that a person kisses you,
right,
or holds you, let alone kind of sexual intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not really something that at least women are made aware of, how that should feel and how it works best for both people, then I can't imagine there's a lot in the teachings around the relationship part of sex and relationship education.
No, I mean, the teachings I heard from the pulpit were ideas of women need to be available at all times for their husband's needs. So it was this idea that women don't really have sexual desire, and men are the ones who have sexual desire, and women should be there for them. And it was, taught that sex was good inside of marriage. But the idea that women would ever find pleasure in that was non-existent.
There must be many people that leave these movements and then just have these kind of revelations of all these amazing things that their bodies can do and all these great ways that their bodies can feel. Like, wow, I didn't even know that I can feel this way. I think there are loads of people having those experiences, because everybody should get to have those experiences with their own bodies. And that kind of brings me onto the subject of autonomy, personal autonomy, and kind of more into that discussion on gender roles, because you talk a lot in your book, in your earlier years before kind of the idea of marriage, this stay-at-home daughter role that is becoming more of a thing in Christian patriarchal spaces. And I wondered if you could describe to us what you mean when you say a stay-at-home daughter.
Yeah, so the stay-at-home daughter part of this was made popular through Vision Forum, which I mentioned earlier. It was an organization. They called themselves a ministry, but they also had a business they sold homeschooling products and very gender role-based toys for kids. And it was this idea that because girls are supposed to grow up and get married and have kids, it's pointless for them to go to college or have a career when they'll just have to give up all of that when they start a family. So it was termed as it's a waste of time. And also it would give girls this idea of independence, which they shouldn't have. And instead, you stay home with your parents until your father helps you find a husband. And so that's why we were called stay-at-home daughters, not stay-at-home wives yet, but stay-at-home daughters. And while you are staying home after you turn 18, you are supposed to practice being a stay-at-home wife and mother by serving your dad. So learning how to make his coffee, learning how to cook, learning how to buy groceries, all these homemaking skills. And it was all directed towards making your father happy. So there's that emotional, some people call this emotional incest of fitting that role that you shouldn't have as a daughter with your father. And So I was a stay-at-home daughter until I was 25. And so those 7 years of my life, I did what I was told. I didn't go to college. I was allowed to do a couple things that made some money. So I was allowed to help homeschool other kids in the homeschooling community. I was allowed to teach piano lessons because I wouldn't have a boss. My dad would be my supervisor, and I was able to make some money that way. But a lot of stay-at-home daughters aren't allowed to have their own bank accounts. I was lucky that my parents let me have my own bank account. But a lot of stay-at-home daughters don't have that. They don't have driver's license. Sometimes they don't have their birth certificates. It's a situation where you can't just walk out the door and leave. And I think what people don't understand is there are still girls being kept at home this way. That terminology of the stay-at-home daughter is not quite as popular as it used to be, probably for apparent reasons, but this is still happening. Girls are still being, groomed to not understand that they have independent rights. And so they're kept at home for years past, when they become a legal adult and don't have the resources or the knowledge to even leave. And so this is an ongoing thing. I don't know if it's quite as popular as it used to be, but definitely there are still many families in the U.S. who are doing this.
Coercive and controlling behavior that you read about with intimate partner violence environments, it's just that kind of replicated, but in a way that psychologically and spiritually imprisons people. And it's so hard to hear you describe it that way, of just there being so many people that are locked up in these environments, unable to leave. I think it's really important to highlight what you said about how people can't just walk away, because the biggest and most frustrating misconception that people have when they don't understand what coercive control looks like, or what cults look like, or what high demand environments look like, is that people can't just walk away. So this idea of why don't you just leave, or I would never join that, or I would never be a part of that, or I would never let anyone control me in that way. It's not explicit, otherwise it wouldn't be happening to most of the people that it happens to, unfortunately. But I think it's important to make a point of that when that point is raised in these discussions. You also mentioned earlier as well that you recognized an increase in your father's controlling behavior towards you as a child, and kind of around the time that you started being homeschooled, and then it escalated from there. What were some of the key moments you remember in those changes? And can you pinpoint any particular figures or propaganda or teachings that were the cause of some of that extremism coming through?
Yeah. So, starting in kindergarten was when I was being homeschooled. So I was age 5, and then we were living in Pennsylvania, and that's where we became friends with some other people in this movement who went to our church. And the way I remember it is they introduced my dad to Patriarchy magazine, which was this kind of grassroots, printed in somebody's basement magazine that spread these ideas. It was very much propaganda. I was able to find some recently on eBay and read them. I was like, oh, this is exactly how I remember it, which was validating. I didn't make this up. This was, for years and years, this magazine was printed. And it would teach you how to spank your kids, and how men should be in charge, and how women should submit. And it was directed towards men. And there's always one page in the back that was written by the man who wrote this magazine, or who started this magazine. His name is Phil Lancaster. And so his wife would write one page in the back for the ladies. And it was about being content. And sometimes you get sad about, being a homemaker, but in the long scheme of things, you're going to be happy with God's rewards. And so it was very much a propaganda thing to keep people in control and to follow these rules. And so that was in our home all the time. On top of, I don't know if you've heard of Doug Wilson. over in the UK, but has been a big figure in the Christian patriarchy movement and now in the Christian nationalist movement. We got his magazine, which was called Credenda Agenda, for years. And he was very influential in our family. We had, all of his books on tape and his sermons, and we would listen to him in the car all the time. And he had very extreme ideas about women. Like, if you just listen to anything he said online, he says things like women are the ones who make sandwiches. Like, it sounds so cliche, but he's being very serious about that. And that idea of women should be available for men at all times was very emphasized by him and his wife. And they live in Moscow, Idaho. So they are still very influential in the US. And after that, once we moved to Colorado, we got involved with Vision Forum, which was that organization I mentioned earlier. And Doug Phillips was the leader of that organization until it fell apart after sexual abuse allegations came out. And so, these leaders were the ones who were telling us what to do and how to do them. And it led to us finding a church with a leader just like that. And I talk about this in my book. His name was Kevin Swanson. He's also still a very influential homeschooling leader here. And now he's even making his own homeschool curriculum. So, it's frustrating to see decades of this happening. And sometimes people think that my story is just in the past, but it's an ongoing situation. And these men are still out there causing harm with their teachings. And so I can pinpoint when we were introduced to these leaders, when we had those books and magazines. It was very much like a propaganda type of situation, but I didn't know any different. And my dad was looking for this. So his personality, I think, was reaching for things that would give him more control over his life and his family. I think other people might have fallen into this movement in different ways, but that's just how his personality worked.
Was there ever a point when you were growing up as a teenager or a young woman where you started to think and feel things for yourself that were outside of this group, that were kind of like maybe what might be described as rebellious, and things that would have seen you in a bad position, maybe with your father, had he found out about things?
I struggled so much with this because I was very much the good girl. Like, I was trying to be good all the time. And so any little tiny error I made, I usually confessed to him. There were some things, like, I remember my older sister was much better at hiding things than I was. And she was more rebellious, what my dad would call rebellious. She was more feisty than I was. And so sometimes I would get her, like, she had this secret Dixie Chicks, now they're called the Chicks, but their CD, and I borrowed it for a while, and then I felt so guilty about it, I gave it back. So things like that, or the movie Sense and Sensibility, which is so mild, but just this idea of romantic love was out of bounds, right? And so the fact that people in this movie and in the book were falling in love before they were betrothed was rebellious. And so that's what I really wanted. I wanted to have this romantic experience, not this courtship and then equals marriage experience. And so those things I kept secret because, that was not something I wanted to talk with my dad about. It's something that wouldn't have been allowed. And also things like wanting to study music in college. I didn't really talk to them about that because that wasn't even an option. But I had an uncle who was like, "Oh, you should go to college and study music." And I was like, "Yeah." I didn't really know what to say. But that gave me this idea of like, maybe what if I was good enough to study music in college? Like, what would that be like? And so I imagined things like that, but I didn't really have the power to act on them.
Did you ever find yourself in a situation with somebody that you were romantically interested in before you were betrothed to anybody?
Yes, that's a big part of my story, is following my heart.
Yes, I love it so much.
When I was a teenager, I had crushes on, the few boys that there were at church, and I would write about them. in my diary, and then I would go back and I would cover it up with whiteout because I was so embarrassed and so ashamed. So like this ongoing struggle since I was little of like, what is love? What is good, a good kind of love? And when I was 20, I started a courtship with a man in our church, and I think it lasted about 8 months until my dad ended it. And I talk a little bit about that in the book, about those reasons and why I'm happy actually that I didn't get married to him. But I was in love with him and I thought I was going to get married. And so when my dad broke it off, I was devastated. And, you know, I think that's this moment when it hit me. I don't have any say over my life. Like my dad can just say, you're getting married to this person, you're not getting married to that person. And then I could just be stuck in my parents' house forever. At the same time, my dad was saying, your emotions are sinful, you need to repent. And it's not okay for you to love this person when you're not going to get married. And that's when my rebellious heart really started to wake up, because I was like, I can't understand why God would want me to not love someone, or that God would send me to hell for loving somebody, as if that was a sin. And so that was a big moment for me. I was 21 when the courtship broke off. And I made this promise to myself that's never going to happen again. I'm never going to let my dad stop a relationship that I want. And a few years later, I did fall in love with somebody else. And my dad let us have a courtship for 1 week. And then he changed his mind. And then that old promise came back to me. And I was like, I'm not going to let this happen again. And so that's when we had like a secret romantic relationship. And it was a lot of fun and also very scary and traumatizing, because my dad was very controlling, and anytime I broke the rules, I was very much in trouble, yelling at me and calling me names, and verbal abuse started escalating with that. At the same time, following my heart and realizing I deserve love, and this person loves me unconditionally, and I can lean into that and find safety there. That was such a pivotal moment for me of realizing this is what love looks like. It's not control. It's empowering and freeing. And this person didn't try to put me into a box and wanted me to be my own person. So, that was a big moment for me. And I wanted to elope, but it didn't work out that way. We did actually get married with in a church, and all of that convinced my dad to come to the wedding. And it was a very complicated situation, but it worked out the way it worked out. And what mattered was that we could be there for each other as we left this community and figured out how to be adults together and grow outside of that world.
It makes me so teary. I love love, and I love when love wins. And I was like, yes, when I was reading your book, I was like, because I was worried that there was going to be this repetition. And I was like, I don't know how many times Cait can go through this kind of like, it was like putting out any flames of hope. And I was like, I feel like this is just going to happen over and over.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be whenever you had a genuine interest in somebody and they had and it was reciprocated, and your dad was like, oh, hang on a minute, I want her in a relationship and marriage with somebody that she actually has no interest in, maybe to carry on being the main controlling influence in your life, or the
Right.
most important role model and figure and person in your life. So
Exactly.
I was so excited when love was winning, and I love it so much. You just mentioned there as well that you were able to kind of navigate your way out of Christian patriarchy together. How did that come about, and what were some of the immediate challenges that you faced for yourself and as a couple, trying to kind of weave your way through all of these new experiences?
Yeah, I mean, we really took a lot of risks. We kind of just were like, this isn't, it's worth it to fight for this relationship. And so we decided to move back to where my husband David is from, which is Michigan, and start a new life. It was really scary. I didn't have any job experience besides like teaching piano lessons. And, all the family dynamics were stressed. And that was probably the most difficult thing, is not really having any family support. At the same time, it gave us a lot of freedom to figure out what we wanted and who we were, because we had lost so much already. It was like really starting fresh. And I feel like we were so young and we were so naive, and also had gone through a lot of terrible things that we just didn't know what we were getting into. We worked really hard. I finally got a job and started going to school together. And that was really amazing that we could both go to college and figure out how to do that, because we were learning together. And I think that really helped, was that we were trying to grow out of our pasts and into something new. And we were both wanting to do that. And so we are different people than we were 11 years ago when we got married. When we first got married, we went to church for a long time. That was one of our biggest things, was me trying to explain, like, I see patriarchy here too. I see the way women are treated here. And he couldn't see that as clearly because, he's a white man and he's been being accepted as a leader and being praised for things. And he didn't see the way women were being treated. And so it took a lot of conversation and him realizing how I was being treated differently for us to finally leave and find a different way of living. And so we haven't been back to church since that experience. And that was really stressful, because he's a pastor's kid. I was an elder's kid. And so church has always been part of our lives. And having to navigate, what does it look like to build community and friendship outside of a church, has been so difficult, but also so important to us to learn how to do that. And yeah, I think we're still on that journey. I think we're still learning. Sometimes I feel like that little girl who has no idea what I'm doing. And other times I can see, I've built a new kind of life for myself. Yeah, it's like the messy way of life, I suppose.
I also stumble my way through every day feeling like maybe this is how you do it. Maybe this is how it's done. Everyone else looks like they know what they're talking about, and everyone else looks like they know their shit. And then I'm like, actually, I think everybody's just pretending to know what they're doing, and actually no adult knows what they're doing. So yeah, I'm a fellow stumbler. So much of the themes in your book are around surviving and survivorship. And I wanted to ask you, as we come towards the end of our conversation today, what does thriving look like for you?
Yeah, I think, when you're in survival mode, you have so much adrenaline and your nervous system is off balance and you're just trying to get through the day. And working through trauma therapy has helped me calm down my nervous system. I did go through some psychological testing last year, and the psychologist said my nervous system, I've never been in a place where it has a baseline. And so I've always been in kind of that triggered state since I was a little kid because of what happened to me. And so creating a new baseline is what I've been trying to focus on the past year, of where am I safe? How do I find safety within myself? Not depending on getting that from an outside source, like a religion or a person or a relationship, but finding that safety within has been really important to me, to just enjoy life, to feel alive. Part of that is embodiment and learning to feel safe with my body instead of dissociated all the time. And so I incorporate a lot of things. I feel like before, there was one source of safety, and that was the church and the religion. And now it feels like I want a bigger root system. I want more support than just one thing. And so I want to have a therapist. I want to have good friendships and a good partner relationship. And I want to do yoga sometimes, and I want to be in nature, and I want to have good books to read, and I want to be able to give back to my community and be, like an active citizen in my community, my state in the US, like being a voter and caring about the issues here. There's all these things that give life texture and meaning. And I want all of them instead of just one tiny thing where if it falls apart, then everything falls apart. And so I think it's important to say there are so many aspects to life, and sometimes some things are more stronger than others, and that's okay. Having all of it and finding community in different ways and finding that sense of internal safety has given me the chance to learn how to thrive. I'm not going to pretend like I have it all figured out. I still have PTSD. I still have anxiety. And that takes maintenance, right? That takes treatment. And so I'm not going to pretend like that doesn't exist. But also there are so many resources now for people like us to have a life that is meaningful.
So beautiful. I love that so much. It reminds me of a thing that somebody said to me when I was a lot younger and, falling in and out of love really quickly. And somebody said, you shouldn't make somebody your whole world, because when they're not there anymore, you have nothing. And it's only been in the last few years that I realized that that can apply not only to people, but to belief systems, to jobs, to inanimate objects that we have in our lives, devices. If you make something your whole world, if it breaks, if it leaves, if you stop believing in that belief system, then there's nothing. And to rebuild from that will take a whole lifetime, as I'm sure you're still recovering every day and putting pieces back together every day and deciding what you keep as Cait and what you leave behind as something that was instilled in you as a child, but perhaps you don't want to bring with you.
Right. Yeah, like it's like you can look back and nothing is all bad or all good. Like my relationship with my dad, like we don't have contact anymore, but I can still look back and remember good. There's a few good memories I like to hold on to without negating the bad things that happened. I think it's just part of learning to accept what happened. For a long time, I was just mad at myself. Like you said earlier, like I didn't leave in time. I should have left earlier. Why didn't I know how to do that? But now I have all this knowledge years later. I didn't have that then. And so learning to be compassionate about my younger self and what I didn't know and trying to do better now. Yeah, it's so complicated. The things of my family, I don't want to throw everything out. I think, like, for instance, homeschooling. Would I homeschool if I had kids? Probably not. But I also learned a lot of how to be a self-studying person, how to learn things for myself. And so I do value that. I'm not going to say I'm really happy I was homeschooled for that, right? It was more of a coping mechanism. So it's just like a way of accepting and like, this is what happened. And you don't have to have morality about every little thing, just accepting what is and trying to move forward.
Well, Cait's book is out online for people to purchase. You can request a copy at your local library if there isn't already one there. So Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy, you can buy from all the big websites, and I'll put links in the episode description on where you can grab yourself copies of Cait's book. I do highly recommend it. I found the book moving but educational as well. So for somebody that does not have a cultic experience, there's still so much value to the book, and also helps me to understand people's experiences a bit better when I'm having conversations with them and just trying to be compassionate and sensitive myself. So that's a whole thing to navigate on my end. So for survivors of religion, for survivors of coercive and controlling behavior, for people on a journey of education, it's a really, really helpful resource, and I recommend people go and grab a copy. And if you do, like I always say, drop me an email, drop me a message on social media, let me know, because I'd love to have a discussion with you about it, and pass on any comments to Cait as well. And of course, you can always leave a review once you have read the book. So for our listeners today, and for me, thank you so much, Cait, for coming and spending time with us. Would you like to wrap up the episode by giving some words of advice for anybody who might be listening, who is thinking about leaving a controlling environment, has just left a controlling environment, or doing that stumbling through day to day, working out the best way to recover?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's situation is going to be different. So you get to decide what works for you. I think the biggest thing is learning that you have agency over your life and you get to make decisions about that. And the more knowledge you have about what's real and what's going on in your life, the more power you have. I would say if you are in immediate danger, make sure you reach out to, here in the US, we have the 988 line. We have domestic violence hotlines. Reach out for help if you're in danger. And then also if you're not in immediate danger, you can take your time to figure out a plan and what you want out of life. Instead of jumping into something completely different, you can figure out what you want, have time to think about that, reach out to other people, learn about all the different ways you could have a life. There are so many different options for you. And I think the biggest part of leaving coercive control is your mental barriers. And if you're being taught that you don't deserve anything better, or you're a bad person, or you wouldn't survive, or the world is dangerous, just know those are ways that people keep you in control and inside of a certain system. And so you don't have to believe that. Nobody deserves to be abused or controlled. And you can find the freedom that you deserve. You just have to kind of, I don't know, it takes a lot of strength to just leave something. And so just know there's a lot of people on your side already, and we're out here and ready to help you with resources.
True, and so powerful as well. There's a whole army of people on the other side, and I, for the most part, would like to think that we're not as bad as people are telling you we are. From inside the box. But what's next, Cait? Should we expect another book anytime soon, or keep our eyes on some projects that you're involved with?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to write. I don't know how soon I can get another book done. I want to write more, go back to where I started, which is in fiction writing. Take a little break from my personal story. I do have a Substack, caitwest.substack.com, so you can subscribe there if you want to get updates on things like that. I am working on some writing projects about similar situations. So I have a piece coming out soon about Amish and Mennonite communities in the US, and I'm really excited about that because it's an issue that evangelicals in particular don't understand. And so I want to bring more awareness about what's really happening in closed communities. And so, yeah, you can follow me on socials and my Substack to get all those kinds of updates.
I will put links to your social media and Substack in the episode description as well. And we'll keep our eyes and ears peeled for anything that comes through the ether about more writing, publications and projects. And please do keep us posted. Any updates I'd be honored to share with the listeners. And I'm just so appreciative and thankful for your time today, Cait. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Kacey.
Thanks so much. Take care.
You too.